everybody. Welcome back to the Dawn of Drones podcast. I'm Dawn Zoldi, your host and the CEO of P3 Tech Consulting. So great to see you all again out there. And it's April already. Can you believe it? I mean, we just had an incredible month dedicated to industry diversity, sponsored by Iris Automation. So many incredible guests. If you missed any of those podcasts, I really commend to your attention to go back, watch them on DroneLife TV, subscribe to their YouTube channel if you haven't done that yet, but absolutely check all that out. And now we pivot in April to a theme of thought leaders for the industry. And who better than to sponsor this month and to kick it off than Don, the Weather Don Berchoff, CEO and founder of TruWeather Solutions. Don, great to have you.
Oh, thanks, Dawn. I'm in Choctaw Nation, Oklahoma. And as everyone knows, April's severe weather month here in the Southern Plains. And we had some interesting weather south of here yesterday.
No doubt, Don. I mean, I think, I teach Homeland Security, and we do this threat and strategic planning course in the spring. I'm in the midst of that right now. Students do projects, and we have an upcoming project on extreme weather and with an emphasis on wildland fires and flooding. Look, this is something that, the world has been on fire. There's been tornadoes, and like you say, Oklahoma, do they call that Tornado Alley? Is that what they call it there?
Yeah, I mean, Tornado Alley is in this area, but it's interesting with the change in climate. Tornado Alley is actually migrating further east. And that's one of the concerns about, from a scientific perspective, is trying to understand how these climate patterns are changing and weather patterns change in a way that will change some of that in the future. And it's actually, we have some scientific evidence that it's shifting east a little bit.
Wow. So you're talking kind of more strategic level. We're going to talk about micro weather here in a second, Don, because that's really what you're focused on in TruWeather. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about you, because I'm sure there are folks out there. And by the way, everybody, if you are out there, those who are out there, remember, this is live. So drop in your comments, your questions, your positive encouragement. We love all of that. And I'm assuming that many of you have heard of or heard from Don in the past. He's kind of everywhere. But for those of you that don't know, Don is a retired United States Air Force veteran, a colonel, weather expert, also a senior executive service employee, the deputy director, I believe, you can correct me here if I'm wrong, Don, of the National Weather Service. And for those of you that don't know what an SES is in federal government, it's the equivalent of a general or flag officer, like an admiral or a general. So Don's kind of a big deal, and he was on the federal side, and he has been, of course, ever since when he formed his company, TruWeather. Don, since this is Thought Leadership Month, tell me what about your experience in those positions informs your thinking now on the weather problem we're facing in the drone and advanced air mobility industry.
Right. So first, I was the director for science and technology at the Weather Service, and my role was to find the best science and technology that is in the labs and universities, fund some research, and get it over the valley of death, which is really the big factor in the research to operations. It's getting these types of technologies from what we call technical readiness level 6 or so, which means you've demonstrated it, you have some software, but now you got to productionize it. And that's a really tough thing to do. And so that, starting there is where I really started to understand the limitations in bringing science and technology out through these. It's a choke point, right? So when I was at the Weather Service, I had a big budget, but I was frustrated because there was so much good stuff getting on, we couldn't get it out. So I like to tell folks what I learned in the Weather Service is we are probably underperforming as an industry compared to what the science could allow, right? And so
Wow.
When I look at the micro weather problem, I know that for drones and air taxis, this is going to be an ubiquitous, difficult challenge, because what I learned in the Air Force is that you need to tie weather data closely to mission critical operations in order to get the efficiency, the results you're looking for in making the whatever action is that you're trying to take. So I was very fortunate because in the Air Force, I got to fly as an aircrew meteorologist for 300 hours when I was a lieutenant. I got to fly with pilots. I got to experience my forecasting. I got to see what the weaknesses were in our modeling, which some of them haven't. Modeling has gotten a lot better, obviously, but when it comes to certain types of parameters like wind, like hazards for wind or icing and cloud or turbulence, we haven't really advanced that much because we don't have good data. And this is even at 30,000 feet. But as you get closer to the ground, the turbulent nature of the ground and the atmosphere make it even more difficult. So I learned, pretty much about where our pain points were to our aviators and also what the challenges were for us in forecasting. I built big regional weather centers. I worked with the Tanker Air Control Center at Scott Air Force Base. And what I learned there was that they were flying about 100,000 missions a year, tanker, cargo, and air fueling. And they were averaging 5,000 weather cancellations a year. It was just,
Wow.
it was just like that. I learned pretty quickly, though, that they weren't integrating weather properly into their decision making. And part of that was our fault, the weather folks' fault, because when you're uncertain and you're giving people uncertain information and they change something in the future, if it didn't pan out the way they expected, they're not going to be as apt to change their mission profile based on a forecast, right? So what I worked on was a framework where we actually control the flow of our recommendations to the end user so that we only would mention to them thinking about changing a mission profile if we were 95% certain that we were going to be right. And just by doing that, by filtering some of that and getting it to them in that way, we cut the delays in 1 year from 5,000 to 1,800. We saved the Air Force $200 million, and it was validated by Air Force analysts. And more importantly, they thought, they looked at us whenever we came to them, they thought of us as, oh, these guys are usually right when they come to us. So now they gain confidence in using our services. And so they would then apply those techniques. And
hey, Don, I want to cut in here because you said a couple things I kind of want to peel back, right? So you mentioned this concept of we just don't have the data really, even at high altitudes, but certainly at lower altitudes, surface to maybe, at least 400 feet above ground level where those UAS will be operating.
Even up to 3,000 to 5,000 feet is
okay. 3,000 to 5,000.
Yeah.
You've been calling this, like, you coined your own term, almost like Elf did in the movie, like ginormous, right? You've been using this term, data desert. Tell us what you mean by that and how it affects this idea or concept of microclimate in the context of what is microclimate? What is it?
So microclimate, we usually in meteorology, we'll define anything that has a resolution of less than 1 kilometer in a grid space as microclimate or microweather. That means that it's like your TV, right? You know how you want a better pixel, you want more pixels, so you get more resolution. It's the same with weather. So most of the products that people are using today, they're either getting 12-kilometer resolution data or 3, depending on where they are. And that means that anything that's occurring within that box will not get picked up in that resolution. So you're losing like fog, stratus, things that are just less than 3 kilometers in area. It won't show up in your models, right? So,
stratus,
you could be
using clouds.
Clouds, like low clouds, right? Stratus is like a scud. You could be in IFR conditions. You won't pick up the winds that are being affected by terrain or buildings or water. And these things are lost. They're kind of washed out. So when you use your app, you're not seeing that stuff, right? You'll never see it. You'll also not see it in your real-time weather because we don't have enough measurements out there. So we have a gap. And so what we do with our models is we take what we have and we just assimilate it and we smooth it out. And then we already have initial conditions that are wrong because we don't even know the date. We have data gaps. So even when you do machine learning, if you don't have a good training data set, you're still not going to get a better forecast, right? So data, it all comes down to the data. And so right now, below 3,000 feet, all we have is 2 balloon launches a day at like 120 sites around the country that give us a profile. And we have aircraft that come in and out of major airports that we get some low altitude wind data. But besides that, ceiling height, cloud height, only at airports are measured. 3% of the country's covered, by that. And drones don't fly at airports. And the challenge is when you take the pilot off the aircraft, you're losing the best sensor we have. The reason that we've been able to deal with this weather environment and this type of service is because you have the pilot as the last line of defense, right? So they make quick decisions when they run into something. Big aircraft don't care about some of the weather impacts I'm talking about. So now you're dealing with the smaller aircraft with no pilot flying in areas where they don't know what's going on. And that's the microclimate that we have to capture in order to serve this industry better. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of unnecessary grounding because you're going to have conservative decision making because you're just not sure about what's going on. And you're going to have more, people are going to push the envelope when they have to make money, and they're going to have more incidences because they really don't know what's going on.
Yeah, and that's obviously not going to be good if we have increased incidences, to be sure. But this is it really exacerbated not only with unmanned aircraft and the concept there's no pilot on board, but doubly so in beyond visual line of sight operations. Is that right?
Yeah, because, you just don't know what you don't know, right? So we hold pilots accountable today for having all the information they need to make decisions in flight, and they make that risk based. But if we don't give them the data, how are they going to be responsible for that? I mean, you can't make somebody be responsible for something they can't know. And so, the challenge, so we're working on weather data standards to try to get more sensing out there to close these gaps, lower cost sensors, moving from certifying instruments to data performance standards. We want to open up the spigot for innovation. We want to close these data gaps, get more data. And there's certain things we're working on the ASTM F38 to open those rules up. I've been talking to the FAA, working very closely with them. I think we're on a positive path. I think they're going to move in that direction, which is good, because then what we do is we open, when we can't depend on the government to pay for this infrastructure. It's not going to happen. We have to incentivize the states, the local governments, and the private sector to put out instruments, get that data collected. We can, worry about the business model, whether who pays for what. There's several different business models. But the key first is to get the rules so that it's acceptable to do that, and then we'll shake out the business models.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's kind of break that down, because you've mentioned two things: sensors, and you mentioned rules. So let's talk about the rules first, and then we'll talk about the sensors, because looping back to your earlier comments, we were talking about this, data desert. That's just kind of a lack of information. But then getting to the sensors, I think now we're talking about quality of information when we get it. And that quality, as you mentioned earlier as well, of information that goes to the end user. So let's table the sensor and kind of quality discussion for a second. And let's focus on these standards, because Don, you and I have talked, and by the way, incredible event that you hosted at Accelerate in Leesburg, Virginia, a couple weeks back, with Marcy Eisenberg and crew. That Beyond Visual Line of Sight and Weather Operations event, so many amazing folks. And you really focused on this. You focused quite a bit on, kind of the standards, because as we all know, I think most of us watching this know, the Beyond Visual Line of Sight Aviation Rulemaking Committee report came out, right? 400 plus pages of information. And I forget who it was. One of your panelists said they counted the number of times weather was mentioned in that ginormous document, and it was maybe like 32 or less. So tell me about your concerns when it comes to, the ARC, or maybe a notice of proposed rulemaking, what should be in there about weather, and how that plays into the standards conversations you're having with ASTM, the FAA, and others.
So everyone, folks that don't understand is that manned aviation, you can't just provide weather and fly. You have to get it from an approved source. So approved sources are the National Weather Service and any third-party provider that goes through a very rigorous process to ensure that they're meeting the standards required for a OEM or an operator to safely fly. And that OEM or operator has to actually place on their certificate that they're using a third-party weather provider on their certificate. And they're responsible for certifying that provider, which is kind of difficult. So So I think that's important. So we're not, Don is not trying to make things harder, right? Don is trying to figure out how do we make things easier. Because if you look at the way this is set up today, you can only use National Weather Service products, which aren't granular enough. So that gets me to the second point. Manned aviation, folks that have been flying for many years, they've been on the aircraft, they get themselves out of, helicopter pilots especially, get themselves out of tough weather situations where there was unnoticed weather or invisible threats that we can't see. These aviators are flying a lot bigger aircraft, and the things that affect them, are not, really in micro weather aren't really relevant, right? So now we're bringing a very, experienced core of pilots who have only worked in one paradigm, and now it's difficult to imagine that weather could be such a problem because they've dealt with it their whole life and they managed to work okay around it. But in this new paradigm where you're doing beyond visual line of sight and you don't have a pilot, it's totally different. You've lost that heuristic. So what I'm working
Don,
on.
I want to cut in there because I mean you're reminding me that we had a spectacular clubhouse last Thursday, and for those of you that were not able to join us, number one, follow the Drone Law Connections on Clubhouse. Join in every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Go back and listen to his replay if you weren't there, because we had a manned aircraft pilot who also is a drone pilot, right? This person wears the both hats and kind of challenged you on the fact that there is really not a problem here because look, I get this weather all the time. And it seems good enough for me, as a manned aircraft pilot. I think this person said with 20,000 plus flight hours. And I loved your response. It was so good. So I don't know if you want to kind of foot stomp this because you're alluding to it, the fact that you might be a manned aircraft pilot, but what you have and what you're used to isn't going to cut it at those low altitudes.
Right. So that individual had 4,000 manned hours, and
4,000.
I think about 200 drone hours. And I asked her, I said, okay, so how many BV loss hours? And she said 50. And I said, okay, so I'm assuming you only pick good weather days to fly that. And she said, yeah. I said, well, that's the problem. I said, you can't cherry pick your weather when you are trying to make money.
Yeah, when you're delivering goods or
Right.
medicine, or organs, God forbid.
Right. Right. And so she has never had that experience of having to fly a drone and not know really what's happening. And that's really difficult for people who haven't, who are so used and so confident in what they do, which they deserve to be, right? In their manned flight, they are probably the best experts in the world. But when it comes to this is a whole new area. So this has been my challenge to try to paint a picture of what it's going to be like. Because if we don't start working on this problem now, innovation takes time. It takes time to get an industry to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. I've been working on this for 3 years and I'm still getting those kind of questions. So it tells me I'm either not doing a good job or we're not getting enough education out there, right? So when it comes to the ARC, when you only see weather 32 times, it's also an indicator that the senior leaders are not really getting it either. Now, what I will tell you is that the mid folks in the FAA are getting it. We have great relationships and we're working this together. And I'm confident we're going to get what we need. But here's the thing is that we need to change the standards to get away from certifying instruments, because if you want a certified weather instrument, it's going to cost you $150,000 to $200,000. That's what the ASOSs are at the airports. And we can't put those everywhere because they're not affordable. There's some really good sensors out there that are military grade that were used in Bagram and other places that are like 30 or 40,000 that give you almost the same information. And we got to get those into the mix. And the way you do that is you move away from being so specific about saying that sensor is certified to a data performance standard where you turn in your data from that sensor, you turn it in an area where we have other ubiquitous weather data. We can validate and calibrate how good your data is. We can mark it with metadata. We can blockchain it, and then we could get it turned around and out for discovery to UTMs and others. And we will be able to drive the cost down. We'll get of these sensors. We also can use very low cost sensors, like $600-700 sensors, the same way. And we could start really closing gaps without breaking the bank. So that's the first rule we need. The second thing is we got to get away from making the operator and the certificate holder validate the weather company they're using. That's crazy. How could somebody do that, right? So what we want to do, and the FAA is on board with this, is we want to make these weather companies more self-certifying, but they're going to have to go through a certification process, turn in their data, and they're going to have to prove that they're using sound science. Here's the problem. Anyone could put out a shingle and say, this is my weather forecast. And many people will not know the difference in the quality of it, right? It's like, so you can't have that in aviation. So I'm going back to what I said originally. Weather has always been regulated in aviation for a reason. We need to continue that process, except we've got to change the rules to make it more agile, to get more crowdsourcing of data, and make it easier for third-party companies to play in this game. Because if you bring those third-party providers in, watch how good the weather forecasts are going to become, because there's money to be made now. So that's really what we're working on. And I need weather to be an essential service, not a supplementary service. And so those are the conversations we're having about third-party service providers. We need a means of compliance. We need to have a well-structured approach to that. And we need to make sure that whatever data is being used has gone through some kind of a check. That's really, what I'm asking for.
All right. Well, you've kind of jumped a little bit now into this, and so I want to get into this infrastructure issue, the sensor problem, the lack thereof, basically. My understanding is you partnered with about at least 6, let's call them low-cost sensor companies, and you're deploying those sensors as far and as wide as you can possibly do. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe what those, where those sensors are, kind of what they're doing? If you're able to tell us who those partners are, if that's something you can do. And then I have a couple follow-on questions on that, because this is really cool.
So I'd like to use the term cost effective, and they're cost effective. All right. But there's also some expensive ones too. And I'll explain that. So basically the first problem you have is, how do you close the gaps at the surface, right, between METAR sites? So there's several sensors that can be used for that. One is the IntelSense sensor, is one of our partners, and that's a more expensive sensor, but it gives you ceiling height, visibility, it's a camera, and that all plugs and plays into our API. So if you buy a sensor from these companies I'm talking about, we can plug that into our system. You don't have to worry about integrating that. You don't have to use a separate app for that and try to get your weather from 100 other places. We're bringing all that together, and we'll feed it back in a single one-stop shop for you to do your planning, and your data will be in that API. And that's something that, I think is really important. Second thing, so IntelSense is one. The other one is called AnaMoment. They have a sensor that's very light that could go on a drone. So it can actually be placed on a drone, which I'm encouraging drone sensors, right? We want that data, but they can also be put up on towers to get the winds aloft. Because we really have what I like to call a treetop inversion. If you have trees, if you don't, there's still an inversion, but the winds really pick up with height sometimes between the surface and 200 feet. You could go from 2 knots, 3 knots to 15 or 20 knots. And if you don't know that for your battery power, you might not be able to complete your BV loss mission. Now, I'm not saying it's going to crash, but it could cost you a lot of money to have to go back out and replan that mission. So we're trying to help people with the ROI to realize, look, you may pay a little extra up front for these sensors and for the service, but you're going to save a lot of money in manpower and lost opportunity costs, plus safety, right? Because you don't want to have to ditch your aircraft, and not complete the mission because you run out of battery power. So that's the AnaMoment. Then we have another sensor that we use from WeatherFlow, which we have in a partnership with them, that if you buy one of their sensors, we'll integrate it into our system and make that available through your system, right? So we're doing that with emergency management. The IntelSense sensor, we've already integrated with another OEM client. They're using it. And this is working out really nicely. And that would be a surface-based sensor, but it doesn't have the cloud and ceiling height. It's lower cost, but it doesn't have that. Now for the winds aloft, that's a big problem. So we have a wind LiDAR that has a single beam that goes up to 800 feet and 10 levels of wind. And then we have a scanning wind LiDAR that goes out 20 kilometers. It can cover a 20-kilometer area, winds up to 6,000 feet, and it helps us in the urban areas to see the winds around buildings and things like that. We're using that for our NASA Phase 2 down at Langley. We have an urban weather sensing test bed that NASA's funding. and we're
Oh,
going to
cool.
be putting those sensors down in Hampton. And we're going to actually demonstrate with those sensors and some of these lower cost sensors in the city how we could start seeing the wind patterns around buildings and things like that. And then the last sensor we have is the Meteo Drone, which, Meteo Drone is going to be rolled out here at AUVSI. We're going to have
Yeah,
9
I'm going to
demos.
stop you because I want to talk more about that.
All right, so
By the
that's
way,
the last.
everybody out there, like I'm becoming, this podcast is becoming known for like the big reveals. And
Okay.
this is kind of a big reveal. Like I want to definitely like foot stomp this one and take some time to talk about it more deeply. But before we get to that, I do want to do a shout out for Anna Moments. So for those that don't know about that company, they're a little tiny company up here in Colorado, my hometown. I met Liz, who is the co-founder CEO. It's a little family business, and I'm so excited, Don. You don't know this probably, but Liz is going to be on the podcast later in the year. Anna Moment.
Great. I love
Yeah,
what they're doing. Liz and
I
Steve.
love what they're doing. They're going to be part of the Volatus Aerospace Above and Beyond series. And when I met Liz at the UAS Roundup, which is, by the way, everybody, mark your calendars now. September 11th and 12th, nestled at the foothills of Mount Princeton, one of the country's, several 14ers, at the Mount Princeton Hot Springs Resort. The Central Colorado UAS Club does this event every year. Absolutely phenomenal. The nation's first and only outdoor drone park. There's going to be outdoor demos. Don, you guys got to come. This is where I met Liz, and we got to talking. I don't know if you know this. She's a lawyer. Did you know that?
No, I did not know it, but now that I think about it, when I talked to her, yeah, I should have known.
And so she's a lawyer, but also this scientific mind, and her husband is an engineer.
Right.
She said they're sitting around the dinner table and just brainstorming on cool technology. And this is where they came up with the idea for this small anemometer. So this is literally born, across the kitchen table. And like so many other stories, you're going to see, Don, next week,
So
we've got Jack Elston from Black Swift
I know
Technologies
Jack
and
very
out in
well.
Boulder.
Know him. Yep, we talked to him very
He's
well. Know him.
amazing, doing extreme beyond visual line of sight with his drones.
Right.
Literally also created those with Maciek Staczura, a fellow PhD, at their kitchen table, at Jack's kitchen table in Boulder, Colorado. So lots of cool technology being hatched across the kitchen table here in Colorado, Don.
Let me tell you, Dawn. I want to make it clear. As a former science and technology director, I take the science very seriously. I only work with partners that I think have real quality stuff. You could go out and buy a low cost sensor, or you could go get a weather service from somebody else. But what we're building here is the best of the best. This requires the best. So when you talked about Jack and you talk about Liz and Steve, and I talk about other folks, Buck Lyons out at Weatherflow. These guys and gals, these people, they're dedicated to high integrity science. So we're going to be built.
Absolutely.
So what we're doing is we're an integrator of that great capability, so we can feed it back to you in a simple way. You don't have to deal with worrying about it. That's my job, is to make sure you're getting the most cost effective and best product. And Triska, I like you. I love you. I see you in your chat. I'm so appreciative of your comment. Obviously I grew up in the military supporting reapers and predators, and where I've got a lot of my education about why this will be a problem in the future is from that time. And thank you for your chat there.
And for your service. And that's a great segue, just for a second, to kind of go sideways here, Don, and acknowledge the folks in the chat. So Chris Wedgeworth is out there again. Whoop, whoop. Chris is like a super fan. He's here every week saying hi, Don and Don. And Marshall Nelson, like, hey, buddy, saying thanks, family, for today's topic. Very important. And that warms my heart, because as you can see, working in my basement for the last 2 years as an extrovert, you all have become my family. You have become, my workplace here every Wednesday morning. And I really look forward to seeing from you and hearing you. Trista Mixon, who Don just mentioned, says weather was always our limiting factor when flying predators and reapers beyond visual line of sight, even with dedicated weather technicians in Iraq and Afghanistan, though of course our level of risk acceptance was much higher. Such a different world with civilians, small UAS in the national airspace. Exciting times. Appreciate the podcast, and we appreciate you, Trista, just like Don said. And last but not least, certainly not least, my buddy coming at us live from LA, Sam Scully, and doing amazing things out there. She just got on and says, thank you so much for the topic. So great to have you, Sam. Don, I want to pick off where we left before that kind of a sideways pivot there. What you're talking about here is this term crowdsourcing, right? Like, so you already started doing that with existing open source weather information with your TruFlight 360 solution. So let's talk for a second about that. And then what I want to do, Don, is talk about how all of these other sensors that you're trying, that you're deploying and you're trying to also deploy further will integrate into that TruFlight and some of your other products. So let's talk TruFlight first.
Yeah, so there was two ways I approached the problem. The first one was, let me take away some of the challenges we have in interpreting weather by end users that cause us to have 40% of all manned aviation today that is canceled or delayed due to weather could have flown. That's an important number. And why is
That's
that?
huge.
Yeah,
40%. I mean, that's almost half of the flights
that are canceled due to weather. Due to weather, right? They're canceled, right?
Due to weather, they could have flown.
Right. And that's because of the uncertainty, right? And
that's money.
That's money. And I knew that. And that's why, but I also knew that we had to get the best data together that's available first, and we had to turn it into something that was very specific to this industry. So what we did was, our IP is based on not using traditional weather models the way you're going to get them on your apps, because models on your apps are not geared to aviation. They're geared to general weather. And so what happens is, when you run a general model, you don't have none of those those models don't do anything really, really well. They do everything okay. So like ceiling height, visibility, winds, right? What you do with these simulations is you want those all to do with them all well. Well, I don't care about certain things. I want the ceiling height, the visibility, and all that to be the best. So we pick the models that do the best at those, and then we bring them into our TruFlight and fuse that together through our mission cast. And that's why when people talk to me, they go, we don't understand, why is yours better than XYZ? And I say, because of the way we're manipulating the data and getting you the best data for your mission and your time and scale. So that's what we found with TruFlight.
Yeah, and Don, that gets back to the comment you made way earlier in this podcast, this idea that there is data out there, not all of it's good. And how many apps do you have to have open on your dang phone or computer when you're trying to fly a drone mission? You've coalesced all this best information data to give, frankly, go, no-go type information to pilots to make decisions.
Right. So Mohammed just mentioned about the UAV forecast. So I'm not here to criticize others. What I'm here to do is educate, right? So what we do through TruFlight V360, which there is an application available online, $150 a year, you can sign up for it. Everything's in a one-stop shop, but you have real data in there also. We have traffic camera information and visibility. We have extra observations. UAV forecast is just a forecast. It means that it's not based on real data. So, and that forecast doesn't do well in the low altitude sometimes. If you ever notice it didn't work well, it's because it's not real data. What we want you to do is we want to educate folks on how to use the real data, how to use that forecast data, and how to use that in a way that you educate yourself that, hey, that forecast is not behaving well because I'm looking at real data, right? And you can make better decisions about things if you have that broad amount of information, which is what we offer. And that's why I call it the workbook, right? Because it's a little bit of work for a pilot. A good drone pilot is not just going to look at their app and fly. They're going to evaluate the weather in a little more detail. This is going to become more important for BV loss, obviously, which is what we're building for, right? BV loss. Site. But if we could train our pilots on how to do this better for BV loss, which I think is a part of my job, they're going to get a lot more use out of it. And that 40% is going to come down. And, having all that noise you're bringing in with all these different data types, it just causes you to misinterpret. You might not be using the right data for the right problem. We're just trying to clean that all up with TruFlight.
And that's awesome. I mean, yeah, sign me up. By the way, fun fact, I did just sign up to take a 1-week Part 107 class in August. So I'm going for it. I'm getting my pilot's license. It's official. So I'm really excited about that. But using your product is something that I'm definitely going to do. When I go out and fly a mission, I'm not sure I'm going to do it really commercially or not, but you never know. You never know. Keep your options open. But Don, we're kind of like 10 minutes out, and there's two really big reveals that I want to talk about at the end of the podcast here before we sign off. The first one is, you alluded to it, Meteo Drone. Apologize, misspoke. Tell us about your partnership with this Swiss company, what kind of sensors you're going to be flying with them, where, and why it's a big deal. I know that's a compound question. I'm a lawyer. I'm sensitive to that, but what it is, why it's a big deal.
I'm used to dealing with compound equations, so don't worry about it. I can handle it.
In the courtroom, by the way, that would be a strenuous objection. You cannot do compound questions.
So Meteo Drone. So, one thing I want to mention is, if you buy our workbook and you buy a Tempest sensor, we'll help you. We'll buy a Tempest sensor and you plug it in, it'll show up in our workbook. So now you get that extra data with all the other data you get. But the Meteo Drone is the highest end sensor, right? It's a drone that's instrumented. It's the best in the world. It's been really validated for 3,500 PV loss hours over Switzerland. It's demonstrated that it can improve the forecast for fog and stratus and severe weather down to a more micro scale. And most importantly, the reason we're bringing it in is that you can fly to 17,000 feet. And for Triska, when you were worried about icing, if you were launching your if you were launching your drone out of Grand Forks, that you're not, you got to be really careful about icing. And there are some Reaper operators out there that are not even allowed to fly if there's forecast trace icing in the forecast at any altitude for them to get out of Grand Forks. And you gotta corkscrew out. You can't just get around it. You gotta penetrate whatever's above you. And so this causes about a 30% Grand Sky customers. It's a 30% cancellation rate due to the forecast for icing. So I told them, look, we could bring the Meteo Drone out here. It could take icing, and we could send it up every 90 minutes if we think there's an icing potential. If the forecast is saying there's icing, we're going to validate if it's there or not. And my supposition is about 30% or 40% of those cancellations, we will be able to eliminate them, because we'll have the real data to know if the icing is existing or not. Because the forecast over-forecast icing. It over-forecasts icing. So this is a way for us to get an ROI, because let's just say you're flying 300 Reaper missions a year down to to do some surveillance somewhere of a border, just say, and you're losing 100 of them. It means that you're not covering your national security mission, and you're costing the U.S. taxpayer money, right?
Well, hey, man, you just told the bad guys, if I'm going to move, let's do it in bad weather, right? Because they can't use their drone. You're changing that. So by the way, I've asked Mike Pahel, our amazing producer behind the scenes, I call him my Oz, to post the Forbes article I wrote about Grand Sky. For those of you that don't know what Grand Sky is, it's incredible, very unique business park in Grand Forks, North Dakota, that's actually co-located on Grand Forks Air Force Base, working with big anchor tenants like General Atomics and Northrop Grumman, doing incredible stuff out there. And so drum roll here, Don, because we got to get to one more announcement. You got some big things going on with Grand Sky coming up towards the end of the year. What are we talking about? What can people look forward to seeing?
So we have a commercial partnership now with Grand Sky to roll out a UAS micro-weather service across North Dakota. We're going to be providing 1 kilometer resolution models, which are now much smaller, which will allow us to pick up microclimates a little better. We still need better data, but with the better data, we're going to roll out the Meteo Drone in early October. It'll be launching on a regular basis, and that's going to be collecting data that's going to feed that model. And that will help improve micro-weather predictions right around that Grand Forks area. And our goal is to get more of these drones out, and even to the western part of the state, potentially. And so what we're showing here now is the crawl, walk, run of, let's start using clever business models to get new sensors out there that are going to serve these new models. So we'll be rolling out that service. And then 1 kilometer resolution model is what my goal is everywhere in the country over time. We're going to be down in Hampton, and we're going to be testing urban weather, wind hazard location information service down there. We have an alerting capability. So if you're signed up, starting in April, we're going to be offering that as a service through our APIs and then our workbook. You'll be able to say, hey, I want to know tomorrow morning, should I get out of bed? Is this fog and stratus going to be out there? Should I wait? And we'll alert you if the forecast, I should say, if the real conditions are showing fog and stratus, we'll alert you to that. So these are the things we're building into our process.
I love that. And so for everybody out there, again, mark your calendars. Like you need to go to the UAS Summit and Expo in Grand Forks, North Dakota. It's going to be that first week of October. Going to be some amazing stuff going on. I know we're going to work on a panel, Don and I and several other folks, maybe some other events out there. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Speaking of demos, Don, you are actually demoing the Meteo Drone at AUVSI Exponential this year in Orlando, Florida, the week of 25 April, couple weeks. Tell people how they can plug into that.
So we're going to have 9 demonstrations on Monday through Wednesday. We don't have the schedule yet, and we're going to fly, 9 demonstrations of the Meteo Drone and answer questions. And the whole goal here is for states and local governments and other investors that are interested in saying, hey, we need this better data because we know the problem you're talking about, especially when you start flying heavier lift drones interregional. When they're flying at 1,000 or 4,000 feet, they're going to be in the weather a lot. And in the northern climates, we got to get this icing thing figured out. Otherwise, they'll be grounded more than they need to be, and that's going to cost money. So that's what we're going to talk about at AVUSI at these demos, and you'll have an opportunity to see the data. And we have our Part 107 pilot, Sam, will be out there. And, we're just really excited that we're bringing this first in North America technology that's going to be flying on a regular basis. Hasn't happened before in North America.
Wow, that's incredible. Can we talk about that other partnership, the article that may be forthcoming hypothetically?
Yeah. So we're also you're going to see an announcement of us partnering with Iris Automation. Iris has the CASI ground system now that supplements their air system for detecting other drones in the airspace that you're flying in. And those sensors, we're going to be partnering with them on getting some weather sensors out there with the CASI sensors so that we get one-stop shop, right? So you can get your detect and avoid and your weather together, like traffic and weather together on the 8s, right? It'll be detect and avoid and weather together, right?
Well, it makes sense. And
right.
Check that out, everybody. The CASIA, CASIA 360 solution. They've had the visual onboard solutions for a while. Last year, they launched CASIA G, which is their ground-based surveillance system. I've written about some of this stuff, so go back to my website, P3 Tech Consulting. I think I called it Unified Surveillance. There's a paper and an article up there about the concept and all the international standards that are kind of getting to this idea that for beyond visual line of sight, onboard, great, ground-based, great, like the combination obviously is your best bet there. We are almost at the top here, Don. I mean, time flies when I'm talking to you because every time I talk to you, I learn something new. I think folks out there have learned something new today as well. We've got Desi Eckstein saying congratulations on the great partnership with Iris. Thanks, Desi. Appreciate you and everything you do for this industry. Women in Drones, by the way, she does an amazing Coffee Connect every Tuesday. So if you're not dialed into that, you're not a member. You should be, and on both accounts. I'm going to give you the last. Let's do a 30-second elevator speech, Don, because I want to make a little bit announcement about what's expecting Clubhouse tomorrow and next week on this podcast. So you've got the floor for the last 30.
So when you look at this problem, it's sensors to decisions. You can't stovepipe pieces and try to put it together and expect that you're going to get the best results. So my focus is ecosystem-wide, sensors to decisions, best technology, best science. I don't have to develop it ourselves. We just want to get into our system and make it simple for our end users. The more sensors that we plug in, the more data for real time to help better decision making. And we want to try to replicate and reduce the impact of losing the pilot on the airframe for BV loss. We got to get the standards to align, which I think we will. And I think it's just a great future because drones in air taxi are the best business case for micro weather ever. And so what this is going to do, it's going to drive better infrastructure to serve this industry, which will be repurposed then to other industries like agriculture and renewable energy, who also suffer from a data desert, but there's just never been enough of a business case to close those gaps. So even drones that are supporting agricultural interests and renewable energy interests, my goal is to work through you guys to then educate on these industries on what they could do with the data. And one last thing is emergency management and public safety. We're very heavy into that. And we're working with Charles Warner and others in trying to integrate better weather information and training into these public safety programs. And any program managers out there, always have an opportunity to talk to me. I don't charge any consulting fees for something, like just having a conversation. So call me. Let's talk about how we can help you get your drone program more resilient. And it's all about building resiliency so you get more effectiveness and you generate more revenue per aircraft. That's really our goal.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, real quick, you mentioned training. Of course, that was recommended by the BV Loss ARC, and having this kind of high fidelity weather training, I think, would make an abundant amount of sense. So when that notice of public rulemaking comes out, everybody get your pens ready, make your comments, get your keyboards ready. That's all she wrote for today. I want to thank everybody. We went about a minute over, but well worth it. And Don, thank you so much for being here. Tomorrow on our Clubhouse, we have Dr. Jack Elston, 1 p.m. Eastern, Drone Law Connections. Check us out. He'll be on this podcast next week. And Don, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't once again thank you for sponsoring this entire month of thought leadership. Just as I started out this podcast, I couldn't think of a better person to be the sponsor for this month, because you are absolutely leading the charge and changing the way we think about weather in this industry. And it is so absolutely critical. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you're doing for all of us, and really appreciate you out here.